Welcome to my channel, where I dive into the darkest horror narratives. Got a chilling story, real or imagined, that you want me to narrate? Drop it in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales. Now close your eyes and let the terror begin. Story 1. I wish I had wings. We'd been dating for only a month, Gregory and I, but it seemed as if we'd known one another for years. I was addicted to him, addicted to us, addicted to his touch on my waist, the way he softly stroked my hair, the smell he left on the pillowcase, and the way he kissed me. I knew he was my soulmate. I thought I knew everything about him. Sadly, I soon found out that I didn't know him at all. My family disliked him from the very beginning. They told me he was awkward, weird, off-putting, that they had a bad feeling about him, and a number of other hurtful things. My dad told me that a 32-year-old uneducated man working an entry-level job as a scrub had no business dating his daughter, and that if he was really going to med school, he would have done that already. I told him that a surgical technologist was a more honorable job than his career as an accountant for a law firm, and that he'd feel real stupid when Gregory became a doctor. A fight started that day, worsening my already rocky relationship with my parents. My parents both agreed that, although they could not tell me what to do with my love life, they disapproved of our relationship, and he was not welcome in their home. Gregory wasn't mad, though, considering the awful way they were treating him. Instead, he held me in a warm embrace and offered a simple solution. "Why don't you just move in with me?" I was nervous, but couldn't ignore the twinge of excitement in my gut. Gregory had a small basement mother-in-law apartment, but it was comfy and big enough for the two of us. It was where we spent most of our time anyway. I left every night with just enough time to make my midnight curfew. We moved my belongings while my parents were gone, as Gregory suggested, and left them a note explaining that I was moving. Their reaction was, as expected, a huge overreaction of voicemails and texts. "You're making a huge mistake. You've only known this guy a couple of weeks. It's way too soon to move in together. You don't understand what true love is. We raised you better." But they didn't understand. They didn't understand that Gregory and I were in love, true love. We were soulmates. I felt lucky to have met my soulmate so early in life. Gregory held me tight as we cuddled on his futon. He stroked my hair gently as he told me how I needed to cut the bad fruit off the tree. He explained that my family didn't want me to be happy, but he did. He told me that my family was only going to get in the way of us, and that I had to cut ties with my family so we could be free. I was hesitant. I loved my family and knew they wanted what was best. They just didn't understand. Only Gregory understood. He insisted it was for the best. He even wrote the text message stating that I would not be speaking to them anymore and blocked their numbers for me. "Why don't I hold on to this for a while?" he said, tucking my phone in his pocket. "It will only bring you negativity. I want you to be happy. I want us to be happy." I missed him every time he went to work and felt so lonely, sitting in the basement apartment by myself. I suggested that maybe I should get a job, too, but he told me no. He'd take care of me and our bills. As long as I was waiting for him when he got home, we would be happy. At least he let me have my phone while he was gone, so we could text throughout the day. He deleted my social media accounts first, explaining that my family might try to sabotage our love. I didn't want that. Friday night, he came home wearing a suit and holding a pretty white dress. It was nothing fancy, but it was smooth and elegant. "Get dressed," he said with a smile on his face. "We're going out." "Where are we going?" I asked. "Don't worry about it. It's a surprise." I put on my dress, which fit shockingly well. Gregory had gone through all of my clothes, keeping the ones he liked and discarding those he didn't, so he knew what size would fit well for me. We spent a couple of hours driving before pulling up to a small white chapel with pink and blue neon lights. "We're getting married," he told me after he parked the car. "We'll be happy together for the rest of our lives." I was hesitant at this unexpected event. Although we had talked about marriage as a future endeavor, I didn't expect to be confronted with marriage quite so soon. But as Gregory said, we were soul mates. Delaying the inevitable would be a disrespect to our love. At the command of the officiant, he slid the sterling silver wedding band over my finger. It wasn't a fancy ring, but he promised that when he became a doctor, he'd get me a fabulous one. It didn't matter to me. I was happy with the one I had. What a ring symbolizes is more important than the ring itself. It was 1 week later that my parents found out. While Gregory was at work, I received several text messages from my parents who had found a way to message me from an alternate phone number. I don't know how they found out, but they did. "It's way too soon for marriage. You've only known him for only a month." "What are you doing?" "What about college? Don't throw your future away for that lowlife. How could you do this to us? Come home before you do anything stupid and we make the situation worse. We have a lawyer who can make this like it never happened. He's manipulating you." By the time Gregory returned home, my eyes were stained pink, the skin around them raw and puffy. I cried again as I showed him the egregious things my parents had said. Gregory was so upset that he took my phone, reading the messages again with an indignant expression. The phone clattered to the floor, and the moment it found a resting position, he stomped hard with his heel repeatedly until the phone was in pieces. I cried harder at this violent outburst, but Gregory's expression settled to a soft yet passionate stare. "Our love, our marriage, is like a tree," he explained, "and we have to cut the bad fruit off the tree, my angel." I buried my face into his neck, overcome with sadness at watching my phone be obliterated. It was symbolic, in a way, symbolic of cutting my old life away so I could focus on my new life. Still, although I knew it was for the best, I felt grief in a sort of way, as if my parents had just died. He held me for what could have been hours. My mind had been in an almost dreamlike state, trying to grasp that my family would no longer be a part of my new life. "I wish I had wings," I finally mustered after my eyes had run out of tears to shed. "I wish I had wings so I could just fly for a while." "Would that make you happy?" Gregory asked, with an indiscernible but thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, wings would be nice," I finally said, with a strange bit of an uninvited smile. "I can do that," Gregory said. "That would be sexy." I wasn't sure when I fell asleep, but Gregory had stayed in the same place all night, allowing me to sleep peacefully, using his shoulder as a pillow. I woke up to his soft whisper that he had to go to work, and that he'd be back as soon as he could. Gregory returned late that afternoon with an excited smile on his face, similar to the one he had worn when he had come home with my wedding dress. He held a few bags in his hand, and a blindfold that he insisted I wear while he prepared my big surprise that would make everything better. He sat me down on the futon, telling me to take a deep breath. I did what I was told and breathed deeply, but then felt a sharp pain on the inside portion of my elbow. I tried to pull away from the pain, but Gregory held my arm tight as he pushed the sharp object further into my arm. Although I initially struggled, I quickly found myself too tired to continue the fight. I woke up with my head buzzing. My mind struggled to find consciousness, but a fog kept pushing my mind back down into a nauseous place, somewhere between dreams and clarity. Slowly but surely, I was winning the struggle. Awareness and sensation eased into me, and I realized that I was face down on the futon, completely nude. Although a blanket covered my lower body, my torso from the lower back up was exposed to the cold air blowing on me from the air conditioning vent above. I tried to move, to pick up my head and wake myself up, but a series of sharp, intrusive pains forced me to freeze, wishing for a return to the dull but painless sensations from moments before. But it was too late. All I could feel was pain, a sharp but lingering pain up both sides of my spine to the base of my neck and down the back of each arm to my elbows. It was a threatening pain that promised retribution for any movement I dare make. My senses came back to me with vengeance. My heart felt as though it were trying to break my sternum, while my chest refused to expand, to let in enough air. Panic set in as I tried to breathe and move, but for every breath and movement I attempted, I was punished by a sensation of ripping across my back and shoulders, as if my skin wanted to detach itself. Hey, settle down." Gregory's voice came from behind me, gentle and reassuring. His hand touched the back of my head, stroking my hair, allowing me a small parcel of relaxation. I still believed Gregory to be my safe space, until what he said next. "You'll rip out the stitches, my angel." "Sant stitches?" I asked with a shaky voice, grimacing at the revelation. Why do I have stitches?" Gregory kneeled beside me and placed an icy hand on the side of my face. His eyes were wide and excited, an expression that I once believed to be passionate love, but could finally see was one of madness and insanity. "Your wings, angel, I gave you your wings," he said, with the excitedness of a child on Christmas morning. I attempted to speak, but had not yet grasped what he meant. My mind kept shifting from possibilities of what he had done to doubt that he could have done that to me. The result was an indecipherable mess of stuttering. "Shh," Gregory said, putting his finger to my lips, barely able to contain his pride. "I'll show you." He showed me a picture on his smartphone. In the picture, I was unconscious, lying face down on the futon. On my back were, just as Gregory had said, wings. The shape and size of the wings matched the pain I could feel, stretching up both sides of my spine and across to my elbows. Imperfect overlapping rows of medium-sized white feathers covered the wings from top to bottom. "Isn't it perfect?" Gregory asked, a shaky, tear-ridden, "What did you do to me?" is all I could muster. "This is what you asked for, Angel. You could be a little grateful, you know." Gregory scolded me as if I were a toddler refusing to eat dinner. He explained what troubles he went through to make this happen, troubles that he thought I should be more appreciative about. He stole anesthesia, a stitch kit, and actual human skin grafts from the hospital he works at. He cut them into the shapes of wings, stitched them onto my skin, and glued feathers he purchased from the craft store. I was crying again, which caused Gregory to become more agitated. The angrier he became, the more I cried, which in turn made Gregory dangerously angry. I pleaded through my tears for him to just take them out and let me go home, my real home, to my parents. Before I knew what he was doing, Gregory's hand had struck my face with a hard slap. His palm connected with my jaw, causing my vision to flash, albeit momentarily. "We are married now, Angel. This is your home," he yelled, his brow creased with fury, an angry finger pointed at my face. I tried to get up, fighting through the pain of the stitches pulling and ripping through my skin. But Gregory grabbed me by the hair and slammed me back down onto my face. Before I could try again, I felt another needle pierce my arm. I don't know how long I was out for, but after struggling for consciousness a second time, the early morning light was filtering through the drapes. The sharp pains had intensified and were coupled with an incessant soreness across my entire back. I tried again to move, but found that I was restricted not just from the pain, but from the tight restraints that squeezed my wrists. Thin rope, the type a hiker uses on those woven bracelets, was tied so tightly around my wrists that my fingers had pins and needles. The other ends were tied to the frame of the futon with no slack. Gregory sat in a chair beside me, his expression softened but still maniacal. I flinched when he reached out and touched my face, but instead of hitting me, he softly caressed my cheeks. Now, it's okay. I'm sorry I got angry earlier. I'm sure you were shocked, and that's okay. But look, you're my angel now. I gave you angel wings, and it's sexy. I asked him to untie me, telling him that it hurt but was careful not to anger him again. Gregory refused, saying that I needed to stay still to allow my sutures to heal. You need to get healthy, my angel, so you can focus on being healthy for the baby. The baby? I asked, terrified of where this was going, but scared to make him angry again. We're going to have a baby, he announced with a big smile while undoing his pants. I know that will make us happy. No, please not right now. I'm not ready. I don't want to be pregnant, and I'm not ready to be a mom. I cried. You are ready to be a mom, he told me confidently. I objected again, but he pulled the sheet off of me and did it anyway. After he was done and was ready to leave for work, he pulled a syringe from his bag, but I told him I felt fine and asked him if he could just leave the TV on for me. For good measure, I told him I loved him and puckered my lips for a kiss. It disgusted me to kiss him, a sensation I previously loved, but I knew that if I had any chance at escaping, I would need him to trust me. Thankfully, he put the syringe down before leaving, but not before putting duct tape across my mouth. I waited for at least 30 minutes after he left before I dared to move, but after I was sure he was at work, I started my escape attempt. I pulled at the ropes, gritting my teeth through pain, wriggling my hands as much as possible, trying to get the knots to loosen. With each pull, the rope strangled my hand more, until pale fingers throbbed and the blood from my wrists soaked the futon. I realized that my attempts were not only futile, but counterproductive. What I needed was something sharp, but I had no way to get to move and get anything sharp. The only cutting tool I had available to me was my teeth. I pulled from my already aching wrists, crying out as the cord cut further into the flesh. My skin tightened across my back, bringing searing pain through the sutures. The stitches pulled with a twinge, threatening to burst through. I felt some of the sutures rip through my skin, but I grunted through one final painstaking effort, and my mouth was finally close enough to my hands. I rubbed the edge of the duct tape against my hands, smearing blood across my face, but a corner of the tape came free. I rubbed again and again until my mouth was free and bit into the rope. Instead of the rope, my tooth sank into the cut that already plagued my wrist. I cried out in pain, but bit at it again, sinking my canine tooth into the cord and ripping away. It didn't do much, but it was enough to give me hope. I bit again and again and again. Finally, I managed to free my right wrist. Although I could barely move it, blood painfully surged back into my hand and fingers. It took a few minutes until my hand was functional enough to start working on the restraints on my left hand. But between my hand and my teeth, the rope soon released and I was free. It was already well into the afternoon. I was terrified that soon Gregory might be home, so I allowed myself only enough time to put on sweatpants before running from the house. I was unable to put on a shirt due to the abomination on my back. The pain in my back was excruciating, and I could feel a steady stream of blood running down my back from torn stitches. I was nauseous and weak from the anesthesia and lack of food, but I managed to stumble out of the door, my wing catching on the doorframe and tearing a fresh wound in my back. I barely made it up the concrete stairs, heavily leaning on the railing. I scrambled around the house to the door of the main level, ringing the doorbell and banging on the door, but nobody was home. Our upstairs neighbors were rarely home during the day, after all. I turned to leave, but my toe caught on the doormat and I fell down the steps, my face slamming into the cement below, drawing more blood from my brow. I lay there for several minutes, feeling defeated and without enough energy to fight the pain anymore. I thought that maybe I could just lay there until I die. The squeal of brakes snapped energy back into me. Realizing a car was pulling into the driveway, I crawled behind the nearby shrubs in an effort to conceal myself. Through the holes in the plants, I could see Gregory's green car rolling past, then parking in the carport with the driver's seat, just out of sight from the corner of the house. With dread deep in my chest, I realized that within a minute he would find that I had escaped, and he would come from me. It was now or never. I would escape or be a slave tied up in his basement for him to impregnate. I chose now. My fear overpowered the pain and exhaustion, and before I knew it, I was running to the neighbor's house. I banged on the door with one hand, ringing the doorbell with the other. A scrubby elderly man opened the door with irritation, forming hard creases along his brow. But upon seeing my bloody, half-naked body, his eyes became shocked and wide. Without either of us saying a word, he gently grabbed my arm and guided me into his house, locking the door behind us and closing the drapes. The old man didn't bother asking if I was okay. It was obvious that I was not. He only asked me what happened. All I could manage to tell him was, "He's coming. Please help. He's coming for me." Without a word, he called 911 while giving me a blanket to cover myself with. I sat down on a chair, leaning forward slightly so as to not cause myself further pain from the hundreds of stitches. Just as the old man assured me that police and an ambulance were on their way, I saw him. I saw Gregory, looking through the sliding glass back door. The glass shattered, sending fragments everywhere, a rock thudding against the hardwood floor as Gregory reached through the hole, unlocking the door and sliding it open. His face was etched with not just anger, but pure hatred. His wide eyes glared threateningly into mine, with a promise of punishment and vengeance. The old man told me to run and boldly stood between Gregory and myself. I ran to the front door, scrabbled with the lock, and threw the door open just as I heard the elderly man cry out, followed by the thud of him hitting the floor. I ran out across the front lawn and into the road, my bare feet screaming as my heels slammed down onto loose pebbles. I screamed for help so loudly my dry throat felt as if it were being cut open from the inside, hoping somebody, anybody, would hear. I hadn't heard him coming until Gregory grabbed onto the wing he had crudely sewn to my body. I could hear and feel my skin ripping from my back as the wing detached completely before my head was ripped back from Gregory's grasp on my hair. A hard hit to my head caused a flash in my vision, and when I could see again, the hot asphalt was burning into the fresh, open wounds of my back. Gregory stood over me, my throat already closed from his crushing weight. "Till death do we part, Angel, and that will be the only way we part." Gregory grunted, using all his strength to make sure I would never breathe again. I clawed at his hands, desperate for air, desperate to live long enough to see my family one more time. With a sudden and thunderous boom, Gregory's head disintegrated into unrecognizable and misshapen mush. Air painfully rushed back through my throat, while thick, hot blood covered my face and torso. The old man softly grasped my hand, putting his shotgun aside. I tried to speak, but he gently shushed me. I could hear the sirens nearby, so I surrendered the pain and exhaustion, knowing that my nightmare was over. I woke up in the hospital, thankfully wingless, with my parent at my side. With their help, I've been healing, physically and emotionally. The elderly man that saved me was also hospitalized for a minor brain hemorrhage, but he too will be okay. My family wasted no time forgiving and helping me heal. The scars on my back, though, the Ones in the shape of the wings I had wished for, remind me every day to trust nobody but myself and my family. Story 2, A Snowflake's Descent. Part 1, The Snow Fort. Christmas was always a whimsical time for young Christopher. For as long as he could remember, Santa Claus came down the chimney, left gifts, ate cookies, drank cocoa, and fed his reindeer. Then he was gone without a trace left behind, with the exception of maybe some crumbs and some hoof prints. The time of year was mystical to Christopher, and he loved it so. Just like any other child, Christopher was also obsessive when it came to catching Santa in the act. Oh, how he would boast to his friends when he finally captured a photo of Santa climbing out of his fireplace, or film of flying reindeer. He yearned for the opportunity, and this year, his desire was particularly singular. You see, Christopher had an ingenious plan. There was no chance of it failing. His attempts in earlier years, 4 to be exact, had taught him what simply would not do. There would be no trying to stay awake, listening for sleigh bells, or setting up a video camera in front of the fireplace. No, Mr. Claus was just too clever for that. This year, Christopher would hide outside, in the snow. After his parents went to sleep, he would take his father's thermos with his own hot cocoa and hide in the snow fort he and his brother built in the yard. That would be the last thing Santa expected. As for staying awake, he was sure he could do it. After all, he was 9 now, and he knew how hard it was to sleep on Christmas Eve anyway. But he didn't want to take any chances, so he would take some fishing line from the garage and tie it to the fireplace door handle, then unwind it all the way to the snow fort. That way, if he somehow fell asleep, the string would tug on him when Santa opened the fireplace door. When Santa finally appeared, he would get everything recorded on his older brother's cell phone. Voila! With bedtime on Christmas Eve, Christopher went to his room to feign sleep until his parents had gone to bed. He lay there for what seemed time without end, until finally he heard the master bedroom door creak shut at the end of the hall. He lay there another half hour or so, ensuring all was quiet, and then crept out from under his quilts. He dressed, took the thermos and fishing line that he had pilfered before, and slunk down the stairs, careful to avoid the dreaded creak in the 3rd step from the top. The front door was the final test, getting it open and closed behind him without making too much of a racket. Starting to sweat a bit in his coveralls, he held his breath until he had closed the door behind him, and no lights had come on upstairs. He walked backward to the fort, unwinding the fishing line, and then finally breathed deeply when he sat down inside. At last, Christopher sat waiting for about an hour before he felt the sleepiness creeping in. He fought it, but he ultimately lost. He leaned over and went to sleep in the snow, depending on his fishing line to wake him. 2 hours later, around 2 in the morning, Christopher felt a tug. At first, his brain translated it to some fuzzy sensation deep in dreamland, but eventually his subconscious jolted him with real life. He bolted upright, fumbling for the cell phone, heart pounding. He slowly poked his head around the door of the snow fort. 2 people, dressed in black, stood at Christopher's front door. He froze, unable to think, but somehow knowing that these 2 were up to no good. Fright overwhelmed him. He wet himself, and he fainted, face down in the snow. He awoke a few minutes later to the sound of his mother's screams. Part 2. Fractals. Chris, not Christopher since his parents' murder, had not spoken to his brother Jonathan in almost a year. 2 decades had passed since that Christmas, and no matter how hard Chris tried, the 2 just could not get along for more than a few days at a time. Jonathan had awoken in the middle of the night that Christmas to get a snack downstairs, and on his way down the hall noticed that Chris was out of bed. He made his way downstairs, expecting to see his brother on the couch, endeavoring to catch Saint Nick, as he always had. That was when the front door creaked open, and 2 dark-clad men sidled through the front door. He ran as fast as he could back up the stairs to his cell phone to call 911, only to find it missing. Naturally, Jonathan blamed Chris for everything after that. The 2 men had come upstairs while Jonathan hid under some clothes in his closet hamper. He heard his mother's screams and was too scared to come out. He heard the men leave with jewelry, etc., and went to check his parents. He could not, would not, revisualize that scene. He staggered downstairs and found Chris in the kitchen, a blank look on his face and smelling like urine. Jonathan snatched the phone from him and dialed 911. Years of therapy and foster homes later, Jonathan had not found it in his heart to forgive Chris. It was his fault that Jonathan could not call for help. His fault that the front door was unlocked. Jonathan couldn't be in Chris's presence very long without reminding him. Recently, Chris and Jonathan had agreed to meet for lunch. Jonathan was wary of the meeting, but his wife, Molly, insisted that he had an obligation. Chris was family. So there they sat, in a greasy spoon diner, eating fried food that would surely shorten their lives in some capacity. In the way that awkward small talk does, the brothers found themselves talking about vacations. The wife and I want to get away this weekend, as a matter of fact, but we can't find a babysitter. We can go another time, Jonathan said. I could watch the kids for the weekend. I'm home. Haven't seen them in a while anyway. Chris offered, overeagerly, trying to buy some sort of approval, as always. Jonathan didn't stop to think about what he said next. I wouldn't be comfortable with that, he stated, abruptly. Chris looked Jonathan in the face, anguish filling his eyes with glassy hurt. He wiped his mouth, stood, left $20 on the table, and exited the diner. That was how they had left it. Jonathan making a snippy remark and Chris solemnly walking out of an already shaky lunch meeting. Chris had looked at him like a puppy at a rolled newspaper. Jonathan hadn't been able to face him again since. Meanwhile, Chris tried to move on with his remedial life. Oh, how he'd hated watching his mother and father being lowered into the cold ground on a gray, snowy day in January. His brother would not look him in the eye. The lady from CPS that smelled like hairspray and cigarettes wouldn't even hold his hand. What was going to happen to him? Would he and his brother be separated? How come Santa had never appeared? He was partially to blame, for being late. He had fallen asleep in the snow and woken up without parents. Now back from the awkward lunch, as he sat in his cubicle at his dead-end job for kids without parents that grew up to be adults without parents. He pondered the last 20 years of his life. He punched numbers and symbols into a monotonous spreadsheet for Sentinel home security as he spiraled down into his regret and resentment, traipsing a snowflake of repeating fault, despair, and longing. Christopher was robbed of experiencing joy at Christmas time ever again. His brother hated him. And for what? Because a jolly fat man had disappointed him year after year. He could not be trusted. To make matters worse, everyone thought it was his fault. They had even tried to tell him Santa was a fake, that he did not exist. They insisted, but that simply could not be true. If it was, Christopher had deprived his parents the chance to live. No Santa was no saint, just a man that perpetually lets people down. After the murders, Santa stopped visiting Christopher, home after home. Never again did he receive anything he put on his list. Eventually, he quit making them. He added Santa to another list, a list of people that had abandoned him. He despised the phonetic parallel between his name and Kris Kringle. Eventually, Chris figured out that mentioning disdain for Santa earned him quizzical looks from, well, everyone. He learned that most thought of Santa as a myth for children, incapable of causing any harm. But how they were wrong. Santa Claus had caused the death of his parents. He was an arcane, evil man. Day after day, Chris sat in his ringlet of blame and desperation for people to understand. More than anything, he wanted Jonathan to comprehend, to forgive him for a crime he had never really committed. As he trudged home, one November evening in the curbside slush, he passed what may have been the last window shop on Earth. In it, a 4K television played How the Grinch Stole Christmas in all of its Suessian majesty. The idea practically slapped him in the face, with all of the grandiosity that the season could muster. Part 3. Making Christmas so simple it was, the notion of imitating Santa Claus, yet so brilliant. Chris would have no problem emulating the man. No, not emulating, but embellishing. A suit was easy to come by, and if he started out small, it would be rather inexpensive. Money wasn't even really an issue, since Chris hadn't spent much except for necessities. Grandiose, but oh, the joy he would bring. Children and adults everywhere would be convinced of what Chris already knew. What's more, he could start with Jonathan's children. This would inevitably kill two birds with one stone, as long as Chris could keep his own secret. He would simply sneak in on Christmas Eve, leave gifts, and Jonathan would be forced into believing that Santa had left them. This would prove Chris's claim that their parents' death was caused by Santa, because he was real. It was infallible. All that was left was to find a suit and decide what Michael and Samantha wanted. The latter would require a bit of reconnaissance, so for 2 weeks, Chris used his lunch break to drive his dying but not yet dead Impala past Jonathan's house. Each time, he would check his surroundings for onlookers and then quickly open the mailbox to search it for Samantha and Michael's letters to Santa. Each time, he would be disappointed. Chris had almost given up when finally, he opened the box to find a white envelope addressed in a child's handwriting to the North Pole with a claymation Rudolph stamp on the wrong side. He quickly pilfered it and returned to his apartment, brimming with pride for his master plan. The contents of the letter broke Chris's heart, but reaffirmed the need for his mission. Dear Santa, my dad would be so mad if he found this letter. He says you aren't real, and that you're just a way for adults to not set a responsibility, but I believe in you. I'm only 5 years old, but I know something happened to Dad when he was little. So for this Christmas, I just want something to prove you're real. Anything will be fine. I just want him to feel better. Love, Michael. Chris's eyes brimmed with tears, and he knew that he had to do this thing for the kids, as well as Jonathan. He had to do something to assuage the pain Santa was causing this family. Part 4. There's a light on this tree. At last, Christmas Eve had arrived. Chris laid the suit out on his bed, along with the gifts he would leave Samantha and Michael, an easy bake oven and a creepy crawler's kit, both purchased at a vintage toy convention with cash. Chris thought the vintage nature of the toys were a nice touch. Who else but Santa could acquire such things? He also knew he needed the anonymity of cash. No one would ever be able to prove it was him. Yes, he would put the fat man to shame. A few hours from now, the kids would wake up and exclaim their excitement, while his brother accepted that Chris was expunged of any blame. Around midnight, Chris put on the suit and loaded the packages into his car. He drove the 10 minutes to Jonathan's neighborhood and parked 100 yards down the street, avoiding the risk of his car being seen and recognized. He gathered the kids' packages and walked briskly down the street, careful to avoid the halo of the one street light in his path. He approached Jonathan's house from the side yard, avoiding the eyes of any night owl neighbors who may still be up. He peeked through the side window and found himself gazing into the dining room, through which he could see the living area, devoid of any children staying up to catch the man that Chris now considered a charlatan. Yes, now Chris was the real deal. Santa would soon find himself obsolete. Then came the most critical moment of the entire operation, gaining entry. Once again, Chris had planned well, and also benefited from his obvious destiny. Having worked for the security company, he had sold Jonathan his security system at a steep discount in a previous attempt to buy reconciliation. It hadn't worked, but it had provided Chris with the knowledge that to save money, the back windows had not been wired into the system. After assuring that no one remained awake in the house, Chris slunk around to the back and started popping off screens and testing window locks. He was beginning to get nervous that he would have to break one when the second to last slid open. And he blames me for leaving the door unlocked, Chris mumbled quietly. The rest was easy. He closed the window behind him, found his way to the living area, and started to place the gifts. Then he heard the gasp. Chris wheeled around towards the hallway to the bedrooms and found Samantha there, standing with an empty cup. How Suessian. In full Santa garb, he waited without breathing to see if he would be recognized. "Santa?" Samantha questioned as she rubbed an eye. Chris exhaled. "Why, yes, little one," he smoothed. "That would be me." "I didn't think you were real." "What?" "It's okay, Samantha. Not many do anymore, but I'm happy to have changed your mind," Chris interrupted. Chris again waited, with no breath. "Me too," Samantha said, wide-eyed and apparently struggling to find the right things to say to a mythical being. Chris resumed breathing again, the adrenaline fading, as he began to think of how to get Samantha back to bed so he could finish his plan. But just then, perhaps the single most unfortunate wardrobe malfunction since that one Super Bowl took place. As the adhesive beard fell from Chris's face, compromised by the fight-or-flight sweat, Samantha's jaw dropped open. "Uncle Chris?" she exclaimed. "Shh." Chris held his finger to his mouth as he shushed her, the adrenaline surging back. He thought quickly, desperate to preserve his masterpiece. Part 5, Run, Run, Rudolph. So Chris resolved to take her. He did not consider the consequence. All Chris could think is that if Samantha told her father what she saw, his plan would unravel. "Yeah, Sam, it's me. Why aren't you in bed?" he had asked. "I heard a noise. Daddy tells us that Santa isn't real, but I thought maybe he was wrong. But it's just you." The lie came to his lips as a final piece of a puzzle that locks in with its comrades. Destiny again, Chris thought. "Oh, but Sam," Chris whispered, "your dad says all that stuff so that no one suspects. I am Santa Claus." Samantha's face showed the delight that only an 8-year-old could. Chris didn't have to try very hard. "If you can keep a secret, I'll take you to see the reindeer right now." He cooed. Samantha nodded with the enthusiasm of a hummingbird sipping Coca-Cola. So Chris took her by the hand and led her outside, back through the window he'd entered through. He had to keep the plan together for Michael and for Jonathan. He took the gift for Samantha with them, thinking that perhaps an easy-bake oven would be a good distraction for her, as he calculated. He led her down the walk to the car, again careful to avoid the street lamp. Samantha, of course, kept asking why there weren't any reindeer, and why he hadn't used the chimney. Chris, absent-mindedly, kept saying he didn't always use either, as he tried to bring some sort of plan B into focus. The easily procured contentment of an 8-year-old once again saved him. He got Samantha into the car and began to carefully navigate the freshly plowed streets back to his apartment. Once there, he told Samantha that because she had seen him, plans for the evening had changed. He would have his elves finish up for him this year, and it was important that she be patient, because they wouldn't be able to return for a day or two to retrieve them and take them back to the North Pole. He gave her the easy-bake oven and left her in his tiny living room while he went into the bathroom. His plan was beginning to coalesce. Chris grabbed several of the Xanax tablets he had left over behind his mirror from his years of psychiatry visits and used a glass to smash them into powder on the countertop. He scooped the powder into the now empty pill container and pocketed it. No way would Samantha cooperate when he started driving her out of town. Next, he went to the closet and opened his small Walmart-bought safe. In it, he kept a large sum of cash, wary of the next time the economy crashed and the banks screwed everyone. He was in security, after all. He would withdraw what was in his accounts later. The banks would be closed on Christmas anyway. He went to the tap and filled a glass with water. He poured in the powdered Xanax and stirred as he took it into the main room. Samantha was still trying to figure out how to use the oven, not realizing that the brownie mixes that came with it were long expired. He offered the water. "Just realized I interrupted you before you got your water earlier," Chris said, with the sweetest voice he could muster. "Oh, thanks," Samantha said. As she drank, she paused occasionally to ask questions about the North Pole. How many elves were there? How do reindeer fly? How long does it take to make the gifts? Chris had a smooth answer for each, pandering to her as she finished the cocktail. Finally, the glass empty, he took it and returned to the kitchen. He busied himself with packing and mapping his route to Canada while he waited for the drugs to take effect. About 30 minutes later, he peeked around the corner from the kitchen to the living room and smiled as he found Samantha sleeping soundly on the floor. He hoisted her over his shoulder, just like Santa and his sack, and took her to the car. He returned once more for the suitcase he had packed with all of the essentials. Taking one more look around to the apartment he knew he would never see again, He found comfort in knowing he was doing the right thing. The car pointed north. Chris had a long drive to the Canadian border. He would have to cross 3 states to get there, but he needed to get as far as he could before anyone realized Samantha was missing. Jonathan and the rest of his family would probably be waking in the next couple of hours and be terribly upset, to say the least. But wait. Oh, how could he have been so stupid? What would Jonathan think if Chris had disappeared at the same time his daughter had? No, that simply would not do. He would certainly be suspected then. Whether or not Michael's gift did its job. No, he had to have a talk with Samantha. Get her to understand. He brought the car back around to the south. His plan required he be present, as if nothing had happened. But could he really depend on an 8-year-old to keep his secret? Chris thought not. He hated how complex this had all become. And then another thought came to him. In the past, Chris had experienced a lot of short-term memory loss when he took the Xanax. In fact, that's why he'd quit taking it. What if it had the same effect on Samantha? Even if it didn't, what if he could get her back into her own bed while she was knocked out? Then anything she did remember was just a very vivid dream. Short of keeping Samantha hidden somewhere, it was the only way out he saw that still achieved the effect he wanted. It would be close, but Chris had to get Samantha back into her bed. He sped back to Jonathan's neighborhood, arriving just before 5 o'clock in the morning. He took Samantha out of the back seat and moved as quickly as he could back to the back window. He went first and pulled Samantha in behind him. Geez, Chris thought. She was really out. He took her down the hall as hastily as he could while still being silent and placed her in her bed. As he left, he took one look back, the pride of a job well done swelling in his chest. Part 6, Ghost of Christmas. Passed at 7 o'clock on Christmas Day, Michael sat bolt upright in his bed, looked outside at the growing light of morning, and hopped across the hall to his sister's room. "Sammy, get up. It's Christmas," he exclaimed. There was no response from Samantha. Michael pulled the blanket back, shaking her. When she didn't budge, even Michael's young mind knew something was amiss. He tried for a few more seconds and noticed how stiff Samantha was, like she was frozen. As fear began to take over, he ran as fast as his short, coverall, pajama-clad legs would take him to his parents' bedroom. "Daddy, Mommy, Sammy is sick. She won't get up," he cried as he shook Jonathan awake. What?" Jonathan yawned as he came out of a deep sleep. Michael continued to share his dismay, Jonathan never really thinking anything was wrong until he got his glasses on and saw the look on his son's face. After that, instinct took over, and he leapt out of the bed. "Molly, wake up! Something's wrong!" he yelled as he strode to the door and down the hall to his daughter's room. He entered Samantha's room and knew from her color something was gravely awry. He did what any parent would, shaking her. When that didn't work, he checked for breathing. There was none. "Molly, call 911!" His voice cracked as he started doing chest compressions. Part 7, and to all a good night. Chris got a phone call around noon on Christmas Day, coming out of the sleep of a full night's work. His sister-in-law spoke as he muttered a hello. "Chris, something awful has happened," she sobbed. And after a long pause, she finished. "Michael found Samantha in her bed this morning. She died in her sleep." She broke down as she finished her thought. Chris sat bolt upright, his hand over his mouth. What had he done? It only took a moment for him to realize his error. The Xanax was too much. He'd euthanized her. Tears began running down his face. "Oh my God, Molly." yet the self-preservation instinct was strong. He had to lie if he wanted his plan to work, and there was still hope it would. Eventually, Michael would realize that he had a gift from Santa, and so would Jonathan. He'd been careful, and his only loose end had been silenced forever, albeit unintentionally. "What happened, Molly? Is Michael okay?" he asked. And so it went. A week later, Chris walked into the wake for Samantha, not having to fake sadness. He had loved her dearly, but she had died for the greater good. Yes, this would be painful for some time to everyone, but the intended outcome of his design had already started to take hold. Jonathan had let Michael open his gifts as a distraction. He didn't know what to make of it. Michael, of course, was convinced it came from Santa. Jonathan was not. Chris overheard him talking about it with some family friends in a hushed tone. He approached cautiously. "Jonathan..." Chris couldn't finish. Jonathan stared at him a moment, Chris seeing what was coming. He had made a terrible miscalculation. "Was this you?" Jonathan bellowed, grabbing Chris by the tie. What? What do you mean?" Chris stammered, retreating. Several attendees rushed in to pull Jonathan from Chris, Jonathan screaming about the gift, and how he knew Chris had somehow been involved. "Explain the gift, Chris!" He kept screaming, falling to his knees. Chris cowered and he fled outside. Molly chased him. "Chris, I'm so sorry. He's just in so much pain." "We both are," she said. "It's okay, Molly. He's always hated me," Chris replied. Molly looked at him, heartbroken not only for her daughter, but for Chris as well. She watched him walk to his car and then went back inside. Another few days went by, and Chris went back to his life. His co-workers sent condolences, his desk covered in cards and flowers each day when he came in. Slowly, he thought, things would turn out how he liked. Jonathan would see no other explanation, Santa would be real, and Chris would receive the forgiveness he'd purchased with Samantha's life. His desk phone rang. It was Molly again. "Chris, the police took Jonathan in for questioning this morning. I don't know what to do." She deadpanned, clearly in some sort of shock. The autopsy on Samantha had been completed. Of course, her blood had been tested, and the Xanax had been there in gratuitous amounts. Unbeknownst to Chris, Jonathan also had a prescription for Xanax. In the end, the police decided they didn't have enough to actually arrest anyone. Jonathan and Molly didn't seem the type to intentionally poison their children, and no one could ask Samantha if she'd taken them on her own. Also, there was the question of the unexplained gift, lending credence that there had been an intruder. Jonathan did eventually come off of accusing Chris, telling him that despite their differences, he knew Chris loved the children and wouldn't hurt them on purpose. The police canvassed everyone living on the street, to no avail. Chris had been thorough and lucky. That February, Chris was invited over for coffee, Jonathan softened by his grief, and Molly still pushing for the brothers to have a relationship. They sat in the living room, Michael on the floor playing with his Hot Wheels. Eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to Samantha. "I still can't sleep, knowing someone was in this house and no one will do anything about it," Jonathan said, quietly to avoid Michael overhearing. He heard anyway. "Someone was here, Daddy," he said, without even looking up from his toys. "Santa did it. Santa hurt Samantha." Oh, how perfect, Chris thought. Story 3, The Dowsing of Balsam Ranch, Far. "I understand," I said, pondering his wisdom. "When I hold hate or jealousy in my heart, it's like a poisonous stream." "Duda," he spoke harshly. The Navajo usually only came out when he got particularly frustrated. He must have seen the embarrassment in my eyes. "Duda," he said again, softly. "No. In this story, the monster is real." I became uneasy at my grandfather's seriousness. I prayed he was joking or trying to tease his granddaughter, but he wasn't. "I've seen it. Ye Naldlushi." He removed a roll of sage and let the end catch fire before setting it to the side. I pondered his action and reached a terrifying conclusion, suddenly aware of the towering black hills surrounding us. Every minute sound played like a preamble to violence. "Are they watching us now?" I asked. "No," replied Grandfather, "but we do not want to invite them with our talks." "Invite them? I don't want them here." "Neither do I," Grandfather laughed. He smiled and nodded reassuringly. Immediately I felt as protected by him as I did when I was a little girl on one of our campouts. "How do you feel when you speak of your sisters or your mother, or think of your niece and nephew?" he asked. I smiled. "Good. They make me happy. I love them, and I feel that love when I think of them." "You feel their spirit of love, yet they are not here." There was a pause. His face turned austere, and he leaned into the dying fire so that the shadows disappeared from his face. A jolt of fear hit my spine like lightning as he spoke. "And what spirit do you think will come when you speak of evil? What you speak, what you think, will invite the spirit of those things. This is why we do not tell stories for thrill of the Yinaldlushi. This is why I tell you to keep happy thoughts with you always." "Then why do we speak of it now?" I asked. There was another long pause as he stared up into the starry night sky and inhaled deeply. "I tell you these things because I love you. You must learn that you may be safe. Your sisters have chosen a different path. I know you will leave for school, but you will return. This is your home. It is left to you to carry our family's knowledge." I pressed my lips at the mention of returning after college. He knew I had no desire to come back. How was he so sure I would? He continued, "Your great-great-grandfather was a white man. I am mixed, as are you. While one world can live in ignorance of the other, we are blessed to understand both. My grandfather knew water dowsing. My grandmother knew the history of the land learned by the Navajo. But we know both." There was a pause as I pondered our family's history again. I had heard it so many times before, but this was the first time I understood why Grandfather was the best water dowser in the West. The sage, mixing with smoke, was a welcomed scent. Its supernatural properties calmed the world around us, and I no longer felt afraid. But the fear began to return when Grandfather continued his story. "I was water divining by a ranch near Snowflake. A rich white man from San Francisco bought a plot of isolated land and was told it would be fertile. Many others told him the land was useless and that he was tricked, but he would not give up hope. He had heard of me and wanted me to find a place to dig a well. Many of the white men laughed that he was using a Navajo water witch. In my pride, I knew I had to prove them wrong no matter how long it took. There was another pause as the insects continued to chirp around us. Somewhere an owl hooted, reassuring us that nothing insidious was stalking our camp. I tucked myself further into my sleeping bag, escaping the cold desert night. Grandfather continued, and I felt the scent of sage grow stronger. I searched for water until dusk. Just as I was about to give up, the rods crossed. They met with such force they nearly bounced from my loose grip. But I could never repeat the finding in the same spot. It was always somewhere different. I looked up to take a drink from my flask. That is when I saw it. That evil creature, perversion of nature. My thoughts were interrupted as the rods crossed almost violently. I paused. Inexplicable dread filled my soul as I stared down at what should have been a welcoming sight for any water dowser. The hair on my neck and arms stood up, an ancient alarm for danger. I knew something was watching me. I dropped my rods and turned as I pulled my .38 Special and aimed it into the dimming desert behind me. The sun was still half an hour from setting, so I didn't need my flashlight. Not yet. I scanned the sagebrush thoroughly. Balsam Ranch was just as eerily quiet. The brush and ocotillo cactus stood motionless, like a backdrop painting made by Wile E. Coyote. The color felt shallow and disturbed me oddly. Everything felt superficial, as if I had entered a museum with wax figures. The life in the place was draining. There was a decrepit ranch house with a window blind hanging partially on one side. The act played out before me like a trite Western scene. I watched the window blind creak open and close suddenly, but the sight stung my heart with fright. There was no wind. I slowly walked toward the abandoned house, trying to keep the sand silent beneath my boots. My eyes darted down to my .38 Special, quickly spotting the brass shining in the cylinder, easing my mind that my weapon was indeed loaded. I looked back at the window. I paused several feet away, not wanting to continue. I knew I needed to prove to myself the house was safe, or I'd be looking over my shoulder the rest of the evening. I pointed my handgun through the window as I peeked inside. It was empty, the dust undisturbed. I turned to leave. Unexpectedly, I recognized a face staring at me in the brush. My heart felt like it burst, and adrenaline flooded through my extremities to my fingertips and toes. I realized the image I saw and laughed softly. "You scared me," I said to the coyote. I was relieved, for it meant there was some life in that godforsaken place, after all. She continued to stare from a distance, concealed in the brush. I lowered my snub-nose revolver. I turned back to where I left the rods. This time I made more noise as I went. I looked back as I walked, fully expecting the coyote to have taken her leave, but she was still there, staring. She hadn't moved, not an inch. That painful feeling that something bizarre was taking place began to loom in my mind, but I pushed it out. One marker down, I said to no one. One more to find. Then I had to discover where the two streams met. If I finished before nightfall, I told myself, I wouldn't have to drive 3 hours that way again. I licked my lips and tasted the salt from the sweat of my upper lip. Granules of sand mixed with it and stuck to my teeth. I spat and wiped my face with my sleeve, pushing my straight black hair from sticking to my face. I holstered my revolver and picked up my grandfather's rods. Longing to begin my long drive home, I looked back at my pickup parked just outside the barbed wire fence, nearly 100 yards away. I didn't trust the rubble-ridden road with its rusty nails and screws. I considered that some careless farmer must have dropped his shipment years ago. I held the rods loosely in front of me as I retraced my last steps, clearing my mind like grandfather had taught me, so that I wouldn't subconsciously control the rods. I thought of my niece and nephew again. Immediately the rods crossed as if guided by the wills of a phantom. It was over the same location. Removing a marker from my pouch, I stuck it into the earth and continued. Almost immediately, I felt static in the air as the rods cross again. I felt a flood of relief and thought I might finish soon, but I was wrong. I followed the pathway of the two hidden streams, but they did not intersect. I continued where I left off and found a third stream. I placed another marker, but this stream ran parallel to the first two. Still no intersection. Faithfully holding the rods in front of me like a guiding cane, I continued, clearing my mind of my surroundings. I felt the rods cross a fourth time and again placed a marker. And again the streams did not pass. Son of a bitch, I cursed. Why were none of those streams crossing? I imaged the shape the bedrock must have taken to form such long parallel lines without allowing the water to intersect. The markers had, too, even a space to have been chance. Maybe it was some ancient form of irrigation below the ranch, for the aisles remind me of corn rows, or perhaps a foundation made by the first pioneers. No, it would have been too old. I continued divining and found another mark which also did not intersect. I was no longer surprised and mindlessly marked the location while pondering the shape of the monolith beneath the saturated zone of the earth, reminding myself of the peculiar atmosphere at Balsam Ranch. I wondered if it was related. Perhaps what lied far beneath were the vestiges of something occult. I shuddered and pushed the silly thoughts from my mind. Mother Mary, help me, I whispered, but immediately felt guilty for calling on her after swearing just moments ago. If a well was dug into only one of these lines, it could drain a secluded chasm of water, unabridged by other streams. I convinced myself the most plausible explanation was merely a unique formation of rocks, perhaps caused by magma or earthquakes long ago. The sun was now completely gone, but the evening sky was still radiant. It would be another hour before the first stars appeared. I had to hurry if I was to finish before dark. The rods crossed smoothly that time, and I mindlessly removed a marker and placed it into the earth. I tried to keep my thoughts on happy distractions, so I thought of my students back on the reservation. It wasn't long before images materialized in my mind about the evils so poignantly expressed through the ruins below the earth. But I pushed the pictures from my mind. Like a horse to water, the memory of my grandfather's story returned. But I remembered his words, "Keep happy thoughts with you always. They keep you safe." Minutes passed like seconds, and I uncovered more parallel streams. I placed more markers. I was unaware exactly how many tags I had set, but I continued my purpose instinctively, like a dog mindlessly driven to circle his bed before sleeping. Finally, the task was complete. I slid the rods into my belt and looked over the barren pasture of the ranch at the many bright yellow flags, which marked the lines of underground streams at their strongest points. They subtly converged, meeting somewhere below the ranch house. I walked to the edge of the formation, overlooking the property. I noticed something odd about the layout of markers, which indicated where the rods had felt the most energetic flow of water. The flags formed something. Backing away, I found a rickety barrel and carefully climbed on top to get a better view. My skin crawled and I heard blood pounding in my ears as I made out the letters. Run. The clairvoyance in my mind vanished, and I lost the merciful immunity I once had against that malignant aura, that inescapable evil enshrined within the abysmal valley of Balsam Ranch. My knees felt mysteriously drained, and it took the utmost concentration for me to crawl off the barrel without falling. My mouth soured, and I felt bile work its way up my throat. Thoughts rushed through my mind, more questions than answer, but I conceded that speculation was only a distraction at that point. I regained the strength in my legs as I exerted them with willful purpose. I turned toward my truck but froze. It was an image of such peculiar horror that my mind was possessed with chaos. It was the coyote, in the same exact spot. She was still staring at me. We stared at one another for a moment. The pounding in my ears had returned. I slowly approached the coyote and realized her eyes were not consciously open, but that she had her eyelids removed. As I walked to the coyote, I smelt it before I saw it. She was dead. She was skinned from the neck down and was propped into this position for some unknowable reason. I looked beyond her and saw 6 or 7 more coyotes placed in precisely the same manner. The disorder and outright obscure events on that ranch had convinced me of everything I needed to know. I had to leave now. I ran to my truck. I couldn't wait to see that place in my rearview mirror. I reached my truck door, but for some reason, it was locked. I tried to peer into the driver's window for my keys, but saw a reflection in my window of a man standing behind me. I tried to yell and turn, but he grabbed me and forced a handkerchief to my mouth. I threw my elbow into his side, and I heard him grunt, but his hold was too tight. I tried to deliver another blow, but I felt my strength weakening. Pushing off the truck, I swung my arm back, trying to grab his groin. He jumped back, still holding the cloth to my mouth, and laughed. "Ooh, you got fire. Don't worry, darling, that'll come later." My vision turned black, but I knew I recognized that voice. It was the voice of that disgusting creep who hired me. It felt like a dream. No, a nightmare. One where you can't run, yet your heart is beating as if you were. My sinuses felt congested, and my eyelids felt like they weighed 10 pounds. I was confused at first, but quickly remembered what happened. I felt the fighting instinct in me surge through my arms and into my fingertips. But my head was still lacking strength and direction. Layers of dust rubbed onto my face and clothes. I squinted, trying to keep my eyes free from irritation. Looking around, I could see I was in the abandoned ranch house. There was a lantern-style flashlight at the end of the room. The objects beside it were blurry, but it looked like one of the blobs was my attacker, hunched over a table. He was whistling some off-pitched tune. Softly squirming my tied hands toward my waist, I felt for my revolver, but it was gone. Of course. I heard a laugh. "Looking for this," he said, holding up my revolver. "I saw you pointed at my friends out there." He laughed again. "Don't worry, you'll get it back, but you won't need all these for a game of roulette." The man fidgeted with my firearm, and I could tell he wasn't overly familiar with a .38 special. He found the cylinder release button and emptied my rounds onto the table before picking one back up and inserting it into the cylinder. Thanks to my mother's encouragement, all those years in sports had made me flexible. I was able to bring my secured hands down to my boots. I scarcely grabbed the handle of my boot knife before he saw me. "Hey, where you trying to go? The fun hasn't started yet." His stubbled mouth parted like an infected wound, showing his gaping teeth. He closed the cylinder on my revolver and walked toward me, unbuckling his belt. He kicked my arms away from my boots, but didn't see the knife. "What, can't get your fun like most men?" I asked, trying to cut the rope around my wrists. "No girls willing to take you home?" I could tell in his eye that he couldn't stand my patronizing tone, but he quickly gained control of the conversation. "Nah," he said, unbothered. "Feisty women like you are more fun this way." "Right. I'm sure you're a regular Casanova," I said, trying to get him to speak longer. The knife fumbled in my hand, but I managed to hang on to it. His upper lip formed a smile, but it was obscenely fake. "I've had women like you. You won't talk so smart when the pain starts." He held my revolver up to my head. I looked at him through phony eyes. "Stupid threat, unless you like your women dead first." "I just like the pain first," he whispered. He crouched to me and pointed my revolver at my leg. He pulled the trigger. My leg helplessly flinched. This made him laugh, so his large gut bubbled against his button shirt. The rope is tighter than I hoped. "Where will it be?" he asked, toying the revolver over my legs. He pointed it to my other leg and pulled the trigger. I didn't flinch this time and instead smile. I could tell he was frustrated. "Maybe an arm," he scoffed. I watched the revolver make its way to my arm, and I knew I must act. My hands were free and shoot forward, seizing the gun on either side and pulling it towards me. My grip was wobbly, because I was still holding my boot knife. I jammed my thumb between the hammer and cylinder, stopping the firing mechanism. He let out a gasp and tried to pull the trigger, but it pinched my thumb and didn't fire. He struck me in the back of the head with his free hand, but I didn't let go. My knife's edge found its mark and cut a deep path into his wrist, covering my hands with his sticky blood. He yelled and lost his grip on the gun. With divine swiftness, I turned my .38 Special back toward my attacker and pulled my thumb free of the hammer. A resounding crack exploded from the weapon as the bullet hit him square in the gut. He fell to the ground with a scream and held his stomach. Blood seeped from the wound and stained his shirt. I watched him for a moment, maintaining distance from my injured attacker. The drug was still present in my head and made me feel dizzy after the bout of physical exertion. He groaned and hissed as he slid further away from me. Wearily, I stood and watched his retreat. "You dumbass," I said. "You can see the rounds in a revolver. Russian roulette is played with empty cases, too." Finally, I saw why he was sliding toward the table. He had a hatchet, skinning knife, and .22 rifle there. I groaned as reached down to grab my knife so I could finish the job, but the drug's effect was still strong, and I wasn't sure I'd make it to him in time. But something else caught my eye. Beyond the table and out the window, approximately 60 feet away, I saw it, watching me. The unparalleled fear I had experienced reading the flags seized my body. I lost the ability to hold a single coherent thought. Only one thing repeated in my mind. It can't be real. I commanded my body to move, but I was frozen. I knew there was another, nearer threat in the same room, just feet from his rifle, but it was no longer important. There was a sole, abhorrent truth that was petrifying my mind. Wickedness is wearing skin. The primordial figure stood like a human, but without a shred of humanity. It was nearly as tall and as muscular as a bear. Its head was the silhouette of a skull, of a once mature buck. Its large antlers reached into the night like bat wings, while its two needle-like eyes radiated like glowing pearls against the brim of its slit, bony nose. Its foggy breath flowed into the cold desert air, carrying the light from its eyes, expanding like a spirit's body until it dissipated. My attacker reached the table and pulled himself up with labored breathing. He grabbed his .22 rifle, but froze. I knew he was seeing that same horrifying enigma that had pierced my soul. "What the f—" His question was cut off by a terrifying chromatic screech, echoing through the valley like my ancestors' war cries. We both watched as this perversity of nature lowered itself to the ground. On all fours, it charged at the house. I had no time to contemplate the paranormal absurdity of this creature's existence, nor to confront the disbelief within me. Currently at war with everything my physical senses were experiencing. My revolver was empty, but I was not hopeless. My attacker would provide my escape. I heard him cry at the sight of the demonic monstrosity running toward him. He raised his .22 rifle and began firing, but I didn't wait to watch. I turned and ran down the deteriorating hallway. Still drugged and not entirely in control of my faculties, I stumbled but caught myself on the wall. The room behind me exploded into chaos. I heard wood snap, accompanied by unholy screams and mortal terror. His cries turned to gargles, and I flinched to the sound of his flesh ripping. I made it out the door and started running down the old driveway without looking back. I made it halfway before a rusty nail pierced my boot and sunk into my foot. I let out a moan of pain and fell, but quickly regained myself. I paused. It was utterly silent inside the house. Panic started to take my mind, but I remembered what my grandfather taught me. Keep happy thoughts with you always. They will keep you safe. I was unsure how literal the meaning was, but I had nothing else to lose. I closed my eyes shut and thought of my family. I focused on them as I continued down the side of the road, limping. With relief, I reached my trusty pickup and tried to open the door, but it was still locked. My heart deflated within me, but I battled it with memories of my niece and nephew. Remember. I looked to the other side of my truck and saw the passenger door was still unlocked. That degenerate must have locked the driver's side so he could sneak up on me. I hobbled to the passenger door and opened it, sliding myself to the driver's seat. Starting the engine, I finally looked to the ranch house. The light from the lantern was still on, but I didn't see any shadows in the room. I put my truck in drive and punched the gas. After a brief moment, I turned on my lights. As soon as my lights came on, a flash of black fur appeared. A haunting image of a deer skull with glowing eyes staring at me sent terror through my body. I screamed seconds before we hit. Violent vibrations shook my truck, but I kept my foot on the gas. Miraculously, I made it over the body and continued down the road, hitting potholes and loose gravel. I continued driving into the night, looking into my rearview mirror every 5 seconds, but nothing appeared. Each time I looked up, I expected to get transported back into the hellish nightmare I just escaped, but it never happened. I was shaking as I drove. After 2 hours of driving, I reached Flagstaff, home of the nearest 24-hour hospital. The rest played out like a hazy dream. White lights and clean scrubs surrounded me. It was apparent I looked horrific because the nurses at the front desk were immediately concerned about my well-being. I tried to talk, but all I managed to get out was, "He tried to rape." I needn't say anything more. They took me to the back where I met with nurses and a doctor. They removed the nail in my foot that I had forgotten entirely. They patched up the rest of my body. The police promptly arrived and asked me questions regarding my experience. I felt like I was on autopilot because no part of the conversation stayed in my mind. Eventually, they gave me a room where I washed and fell asleep. I slept through to morning, or plausibly noon, judging by the amount of light that was coming through the window. I drearily opened my eyes. I saw my sister sitting in a chair next to me, asleep. I smiled and reached out to grab her hand. My sister woke up startled at first. She looked at me with pure love and joy. She rushed to my bed, and we gave one another a long, tight hug. "Mary," she started to cry. "Oh, hush, Jenny," I said. "I'm fine." "I know, She inhaled sharply. "I just love you." "I know," I said, still holding her. "I love you too." After a moment of reassurances, there was a knock on my door. It was the detective. "Can't this wait?" my sister asked with an impatient tone. "No, it's fine," I said. "I want to help." "Maybe you should get a lawyer first," said Jenny. I nodded for my sister to leave, and she reluctantly did. A white man in his early 30s entered the room, notepad in hand. "Thank you," he said softly. "You answered most of our questions last night, and it's been a great help. I need to ask a few more questions now that we've been to the scene." "Sure," I replied, but a burning question came to my mind. "Did you find the thing?" The detective's eyes narrowed, pondering the nature of my question. Your attacker? He asked. We found several strange things out there. I sighed. He would have known what I meant if the body had still been there. I just wanted the validation that I wasn't crazy, that I had seen what I know I saw. He sensed the disappointment in my eyes and tried to offer reassurance. Your attacker is there. He's alive? I asked in shock. No, replied the detective with a nervous laugh. I'll put it this way. In my 12 years of law enforcement, I have never been more sure of a deceased call. I nodded my head. He continued. We found 14 other bodies out there, all women. It looked like wildlife had eaten most of them. This guy was the real deal, real evil. But you stopped him. You saved future victims. I nodded again, but remained silent. The detective continued. It's obvious there was something much larger out there. An animal, probably, of some kind. It was at the scene with you last night, as you had mentioned. Honestly, our guys and gals are completely stumped at what it could have been. I held my tongue, choosing not to volunteer more information on the matter. It's not like he would have believed me, or so I thought. But this detective, there was something about him, an aura, an instinct, a gift. Whatever it was, he knew there was more, and I felt him wanting to believe. I know you don't want to tell me, he said. I've worked alongside the police on the res. I know you won't tell me because I'm a cop. But I'm not asking for me. I'm asking for them. He pointed out the window. There was a pause as he struggled to tell me the next part. This is not the first scene like this I've come across. Those obscure animal marks, mixed patches of fur, human footprints mixed with beasts, gory puncture wounds mixed with human bite marks. I need to know, please. I paused and looked out the window, trying to find the right words. Perhaps if we knew one another better, I would tell you. I heard him sigh in defeat, but something made me continue. I would tell you how old this land is, and the many secrets that lay buried out there. If we were friends, I'd tell you about my family's history and the stories our great-grandparents passed on. Maybe I'd even tell you about the strange things we know of that wander in the night, slipping between our worlds like a hidden underground stream. If we were especially close, I'd tell you about what I believe happened out there during the dousing of Balsam Ranch. I'd tell you things you already know, how evil leeches off of and draws other evil. But I'd tell you that it's more real than you know. At Balsam Ranch, it was real. Evil showed its form and fed off the corpses left behind by that maniac. First it watched and fed on the torture and pain experienced by those innocent women. And then it devoured their bodies as a sacrifice once they were discarded. I stopped and looked back at the detective who was staring at me like a child, clinging onto every word of his grandfather's story. And I'd tell you, detective, to keep happy thoughts with you always. They will protect you from evil.